The bar, if one could grant it such a generous title, was less a place of leisure and more a holding pen for weary souls. It called itself the Sandpiper's Perch, a whimsical name for a concrete box that smelled of stale beer, ozone from the struggling air conditioner, and the damp, metallic tang of the ever-present sea salt that corroded everything on this remote Pacific atoll. The light was a jaundiced yellow, cast down from fly-specked fluorescent tubes that hummed a constant, monotonous note, a sound that burrowed into the skull and lived there. The floor was a sticky mosaic of spilled drinks and ground-in grit brought in on the boots of sailors, aviators, and the handful of civilian contractors who were paid enormous sums to endure this purgatory. It was a place where careers came to stagnate or to begin their final ignominious descent. It was a place of loud stories and quiet desperation, the two often existing within the same man. Tonight, the loudest stories belonged to Chief Gunner's mate Hector Miller. He was a man carved from a block of pure, unadulterated naval tradition, or at least his own heavily edited version of it. His face was a roadmap of sun and sea, leathery and creased, topped with a severe flat-top haircut that defied the oppressive humidity. His forearms, thick as mooring lines and covered in faded tattoos of anchors and eagles, rested possessively on the bar top. He held court from his usual stool, his voice a gravelly boom that easily conquered the drone of the air conditioner and the tinny beat of a forgotten rock song playing from a cheap speaker in the corner. He was the self-appointed king of the Sandpiper's Perch, his authority radiating from him like heat from a furnace. An authority built not on the weight of his rank, which was respectable but not extraordinary, but on the sheer force of his personality and the volume of his voice. He was surrounded by his usual coterie of younger sailors, mostly seamen and third-class petty officers, who listened with a mixture of genuine admiration and practiced sycophancy, their laughter coming a beat too quickly after each of his punchlines. Chief Miller was in his element, a lion in his shabby concrete den. He was telling a familiar tale, one of a near disaster in the South China Sea, a story that grew more harrowing and his role in it more central with each retelling. His hands, broad and calloused, sliced through the thick air, miming the lurch of a destroyer in a typhoon, his voice rising and falling with the phantom waves. The younger men hung on every word, their eyes wide. To them, he was the living embodiment of the Navy they had read about in recruiting pamphlets. Tough, decisive, and unafraid, they did not see the subtle tremor in his hand when he reached for his beer, nor did they notice how his gaze would flicker towards the door whenever a commissioned officer entered, a flicker of something that looked remarkably like insecurity. They saw only the performance, and the performance was magnificent. His world was one of clear lines and rigid hierarchies, of loud commands and immediate obedience. It was a world he understood, a world he controlled. And then there was the woman. She sat alone at a small, scarred table in the dimmest corner of the room, a deliberate island of quiet in Miller's ocean of noise. Had anyone bothered to truly look at her, they would have seen a study in deliberate anonymity. She appeared to be in her late 40s, though the harsh lighting made it difficult to be certain. Her hair was a nondescript brown, pulled back into a severe, functional bun that allowed no stray strands to escape. She wore simple civilian clothes, a plain gray blouse and dark slacks, that were clean and neat, but utterly devoid of style or personality. They were clothes chosen not to be seen, to blend into the background like a clever bit of camouflage. Her face, unadorned with makeup, was pale and composed. It was not a face that invited conversation. Her posture was erect but relaxed, a model of economic stillness. For the better part of an hour, she had nursed a single glass of water, the condensation tracing clean lines down its side. Her eyes, a startlingly clear shade of blue, were not wandering the room or staring into her glass. They were fixed on a small, dog-eared paperback book that rested on the table, its title obscured by her hand. She turned the pages with a slow, methodical precision, utterly absorbed, seemingly oblivious to the boisterous drama unfolding just a few yards away. She was a ghost in the machine, a null value in the social equation of the bar. The sailors gave her a wide berth, their instincts telling them she was not one of them. She was likely a contractor, a scientist, or a bureaucrat from some obscure government agency, one of the many transient civilians who passed through the atoll on inscrutable missions. They were necessary but peripheral, existing outside the familiar tribe of the uniformed services. To Chief Miller, whose worldview was painted in the bold, simple colors of rank insignia and service stripes, she was less than a ghost. She was an anomaly, an unwelcome disruption to the natural order of his universe. He had noticed her when she first entered, of course. He noticed everything in his domain. He had catalogued her plainness, her civilian attire, her deliberate solitude, and had dismissed her as irrelevant. She was a piece of furniture, a silent fixture in the background of his nightly performance. But tonight, something about her stillness began to grate on him. It was a passive challenge to his dominance. His voice was a force of nature in this room, a tide that should have moved everyone and everything. Yet this woman, this pale, quiet civilian, remained untouched. She did not look up when he delivered his loudest punchline. She did not flinch when one of his acolytes, laughing too hard, knocked a stool over with a loud clang of metal on concrete. She simply continued to read her book, her focus an impenetrable wall. It was as if his entire performance, the very source of his identity in this place, did not exist. It was an insult, made all the more infuriating by its passive, unintentional nature. He felt a familiar, hot prickle of irritation rise in his chest. It was the same feeling he got when a fresh-faced ensign, barely old enough to shave, would question one of his procedures, citing a manual the ensign had memorized but never understood. It was the feeling of his hard-won, practical authority being subtly undermined by something he perceived as foreign and academic. He paused his story mid-sentence, a theatrical silence that drew the attention of his audience. He drained his beer, slammed the heavy glass mug down on the bar with a definitive thud, and turned his body on the stool, fixing his gaze on the woman in the corner. The shift in his focus was palpable. The energy in the room reoriented itself, following his line of sight. The younger sailors, sensing a new kind of entertainment, turned to see what had captured their chief's attention. They saw the woman, still reading, still oblivious. A slow, predatory grin spread across Miller's face. He was going to correct this disturbance. He was going to reassert the laws of his universe. "Hey!" he barked, his voice sharp and loud, a command. The word shot across the room like a projectile. The woman did not look up. She did not so much as twitch. She simply turned a page. Miller's grin tightened. The public nature of the snub was a direct challenge. He felt the eyes of his men on him, and his pride swelled to fill the space. He slid off his stool, his boots heavy on the grimy floor. He moved with a deliberate, rolling gait, the walk of a man accustomed to the deck of a ship and the weight of authority. He approached her table, the half-dozen younger sailors trailing behind him like pilot fish following a shark, their faces a mixture of apprehension and eager anticipation. He stopped directly in front of her table, casting a large shadow that fell across her book. He loomed over her, a mountain of khaki and muscle, deliberately invading her personal space. He leaned forward, planting his big hands on her small table, causing it to wobble. The glass of water shivered, its surface trembling. Still, she did not look up. She finished the paragraph she was reading, her eyes tracking the lines of text with infuriating calm. Only then, after a pause that stretched for an eternity, did she slowly lift her head. Her blue eyes, clear and dispassionate, met his. There was no fear in them, no surprise, no anger. There was nothing but a calm, clinical curiosity, the look a biologist might give a particularly noisy but ultimately uninteresting specimen. "You need something, Chief?" she asked. Her voice was low and even, without a trace of the deference he expected or the irritation he was trying to provoke. The simple, correct use of his title seemed to mock him, as if she were merely stating a self-evident fact. It robbed him of the opening he had planned, the one where he would berate her for not recognizing his station. Miller's face flushed a deeper shade of red. He straightened up, puffing out his chest. "I need you to show some respect," he growled, his voice dropping to what he imagined was an intimidating register. "This is a military establishment. We have customs and courtesies here. When a senior petty officer is speaking, you listen." He gestured vaguely around the room, as if to indicate that his words were a matter of public importance, a broadcast that she was required to receive. The absurdity of demanding respect for a rambling sea story in a dirty bar was lost on him entirely. The woman's expression did not change. She held his gaze for a moment longer before her eyes flicked down to his hand, which was still pressing down on her open book. "You're smudging the page," she stated, not as a request to move, but as a simple observation of fact. This was too much. The sheer, unadulterated insolence of it, the complete refusal to play the part he had assigned her. He was losing control of the scene, and in front of his audience, his anger, hot and blinding, surged past the last of his restraints. "I don't give a damn about your book," he snarled, his voice rising back to a full-throated roar that silenced the last murmurs in the bar. "You're on a naval installation. That makes you our guest. And our guests follow our rules. My rule is, when I'm talking, you're listening. Is that clear?" He leaned in closer, his face inches from hers, the smell of stale beer and righteous indignation washing over her. She did not flinch. She did not lean back. She remained perfectly still, a rock against which his wave of fury crashed and broke. This unnerving stillness, this absolute lack of the reaction he craved, was more infuriating than any curse or retort could ever have been. It was like shouting at a granite cliff. He felt a sudden, brutish impulse to make her react, to force some kind of emotion onto that placid face. He reached out, and with a flick of his thick finger, sent her book skittering across the table and onto the floor. It landed with a soft, pathetic thud. "There," he said, his voice thick with satisfaction. "Now you can pay attention." The silence in the bar was now absolute. The air crackled with tension. The other patrons, who had been trying to ignore the confrontation, were now riveted. They had all seen Chief Miller on a tear before, but this felt different. It was directed at a civilian, a woman, and it had crossed a line from loud-mouthed blustering to petty physical aggression. It felt wrong, and the wrongness of it made them all deeply uncomfortable. They watched the woman, expecting, or perhaps hoping for, tears, a shout for help, a retreat. Anything that would fit the established script of bully and victim. She gave them nothing. Her gaze remained locked on Miller's face for a moment, her expression still unreadable. Then, slowly, she lowered her eyes to the spot on the floor where her book lay. She did not move to pick it up. She did not speak. She simply looked at the fallen object. The narrator, from an omniscient perch, could see what no one else in that room could. This was not the stillness of fear or shock. It was the stillness of a predator. It was the absolute coiled calm of a lioness allowing a jackal to dance and yap at the very edge of its kill radius, waiting for the precise, perfect moment to act. She was not processing an insult. She was processing data, calculating variables, and running threat assessments with a speed and clarity that would have terrified Miller had he been able to comprehend it. The insult to her person was irrelevant. The disrespect to her station, which he could not even conceive of, was a tactical error on his part of such magnitude that it was almost pitiable. Miller misinterpreted her silence as submission. Victory, he smirked, a cruel, triumphant twist of his lips. He felt the power flowing back into him. He had faced down the anomaly and won. He had restored order. He turned slightly, winking at one of the young sailors behind him, a gesture of shared masculine dominance. "See," his expression said. "That's how you handle it." He was about to deliver his final, condescending dismissal, a verbal coup de grace, when the world changed. It began not with a bang, but with a sound that was far more terrifying on this isolated atoll. The piercing, rising wail of the Condition 1 Typhoon alert siren. The sound sliced through the thick, humid air, a scream of pure electronic panic. It was a sound no one ever wanted to hear. Condition 4 was a storm watch. Condition 3 meant prepare. Condition 2 meant hunker down. Condition 1 meant impact was imminent. The transition from a normal evening to Condition 1 in a matter of minutes was almost unheard of. It meant a storm had developed with unbelievable speed, or worse, that a catastrophic error had been made in the meteorological forecast. Instantly, the contrived drama of the bar dissolved into genuine primal fear. The patrons, sailors all, reacted with drilled instinct. Chairs scraped back. Men jumped to their feet, their faces pale. The laid-back stupor of the evening was shattered, replaced by the sharp, focused adrenaline of imminent danger. The barman was already slamming down the heavy steel storm shutters over the windows. The ranking officer in the room, a young Navy lieutenant with the impossibly optimistic call sign Sonny, was shouting into his radio, his voice cracking with a panicky treble that inspired no confidence whatsoever. "Mayday, Mayday, this is forward control. What's the status on Typhoon Agatha? We were tracking at 300 nautical miles out, vector north-northeast. Repeat, what is our current status?" The reply that crackled back through the speaker was staticky and filled with terror. "Control, this is Metcom. The models were wrong. All wrong. Agatha's just jumped the trough. She's accelerated, underwent explosive cyclogenesis. Eye wall is less than 40 miles out and tracking directly for us. Winds sustained at 190 knots. Repeat, 190. This is a Category 5 super typhoon. All personnel to designated shelters immediately." Panic erupted. A wind speed of 190 knots was not just a storm. It was an extinction-level event for a low-lying atoll like this one. It was a force capable of scouring the island clean, of tearing steel and concrete apart as if they were paper. The established procedures, the neat little checklists for a standard typhoon, were utterly inadequate for this monster. Lieutenant Sonny looked completely overwhelmed, his face a mask of white terror. He was a logistics officer, a specialist in beans and bullets, not a crisis manager. He stared at the radio as if it were a venomous snake, utterly paralyzed. Chief Miller, for his part, was shouting orders, but they were the wrong orders. "Tie down the gear! Get to the sub-level shelters! Move, move, move!" he roared, falling back on rote memory. But his commands were useless. There was no time to tie anything down. The sub-level shelters were rated for a Category 3, maybe a weak 4. Against the storm that was coming, they would become concrete tombs, flooded and crushed. His authority, so absolute just moments before, had evaporated. He was just another scared man shouting into the wind, his bluster useless against the raw power of nature. In the midst of this rising tide of chaos, the woman moved. It was as if a switch had been flipped. The quiet, anonymous civilian vanished, and in her place stood something else entirely. She rose from her chair not with panic, but with a fluid, deliberate grace that was mesmerizing. Her previous stillness was revealed not as passivity, but as a state of immense potential energy, now unleashed as kinetic perfection. She did not run. She did not shout. She moved with an economy of motion that was breathtaking, her path through the panicked crowd a study in fluid dynamics. She arrived at the lieutenant's side, her presence so commanding that the terrified young officer actually flinched back. She did not ask for the radio. She took it from his nerveless grasp. Her hand was perfectly steady. She raised it to her lips, her blue eyes scanning the room, assessing, cataloging, and commanding all at once. When she spoke, her voice was transformed. The low, even tone was still there, but it was now imbued with an authority that was absolute and unquestionable. It was a voice that did not expect to be obeyed, but knew it would be. It cut through the panic like a surgeon's scalpel. "This is Valkyrie," she said, the name a thunderclap in the small room. It was a call sign, spoken with the casual authority of someone who used it to command fleets. "All stations this net stand by for immediate tactical redirection. Metcom, cease broadcasts and feed all raw Doppler, satellite, and buoy telemetry directly to the Nestac server on Priority Channel 7. I want real-time mesoscale analysis, not your panicked summaries. Engineering, kill shore power to all non-essential sectors. I want all available emergency generation rerouted to the sub-bay and Hangar 3. Confirm you have a live link to the Trident's Tooth mooring system diagnostics." The room fell silent. The panic did not just subside, it was annihilated, replaced by a stunned, disbelieving awe. The sailors, including Chief Miller, froze in place, their minds struggling to process what was happening. The language she was speaking was a foreign tongue of expertise, a high-level fusion of meteorology, engineering, and something else, something harder and more dangerous. Nestac, Trident's Tooth, Valkyrie. These were not words a civilian contractor would know. A voice, no longer panicked, but now clipped and professional, came back over the radio almost instantly. "Roger, Valkyrie. Telemetry push initiated on 7. Engineering confirms rerouting power. Trident's Tooth diagnostics are green. We are standing by." The shift in the radio operator's tone was miraculous. He had found his commanding officer. The woman, Valkyrie, continued, her voice a calm, relentless metronome against the rising scream of the wind outside. "Lieutenant," she said, her eyes pinning the young officer in place. He snapped to a semblance of attention, his terror replaced by a desperate need to obey. "Your shelters are a death trap. The storm surge will be 20 meters. Get on the base-wide address system. You will direct all non-essential personnel to the sealed submarine training facility, Sector Gamma. The pressure hull is rated to withstand depths of 400 meters. It will survive the wind and surge. Use all available transport. You have 12 minutes. Go. The lieutenant stared at her for a half-second, his mind rebooting. Then he simply said, "Yes, ma'am," and scrambled away, a man with a new and achievable purpose. Chief Miller stood rooted to the spot, his mouth hanging slightly open. His world had not just been turned upside down, it had been atomized. The woman he had harassed, the meek civilian he had tried to dominate, was now commanding the entire base with a level of competence and authority he had only ever seen in admirals, and even then, rarely. He watched as she continued to issue a rapid-fire stream of impossibly complex orders. She was coordinating the emergency launch of a P-8 Poseidon surveillance aircraft into the storm's trailing quadrant to act as a comms relay. She was directing a team to use controlled explosives to deliberately scuttle a pier to create a breakwater for the critical fuel depot. She was orchestrating a symphony of survival, playing the entire base and its assets like a finely tuned instrument. She was not just managing a crisis, she was waging a war against the ocean itself, and it seemed impossibly that she was winning. The transformation was absolute. The unassuming woman was gone. In her place was a figure of pure, terrifying competence. Her pale face was now a mask of intense concentration, her blue eyes alight with a fire that seemed to see everything at once. Authority did not just radiate from her, it was the air she breathed, the space she occupied. She was not a person giving orders. She was the personification of command itself. Miller felt a cold dread pool in his stomach, a dread that had nothing to do with the storm. He had not just made a mistake. He had committed a sacrilege. The roar of the wind outside was now a physical presence, a deep, guttural howl that made the concrete building tremble. The lights flickered, then died, plunging the room into near-total darkness, illuminated only by the emergency strobes and the crackle of lightning outside. Through it all, her voice continued, calm and unwavering, a beacon of pure reason in a world gone mad. Just as the first of the truly destructive winds hit the building, sending a shudder through its very foundations, the main door was wrenched open from the outside. Two figures in full storm gear, battered by the wind, stumbled inside and slammed it shut. The first was a junior officer, his face white with strain. The second was a man who needed no introduction on any naval base in the Pacific. He was Fleet Master Chief Thorne, the senior enlisted man for the entire Pacific Fleet. His face looked like it had been carved from naval tradition itself, a craggy monument of experience and wisdom. He was a living legend, a man who had the ear of four-star admirals and the undying respect of every sailor who served under him. Thorne swept his gaze across the chaotic scene, his eyes quickly adjusting to the dim, strobing light. He saw the panicked sailors, the debris, the evidence of a situation spiraling out of control. And then he saw her. He saw the woman with the radio, her back straight, her face illuminated in the green glow of a handheld display she was consulting. He saw her in the center of the storm, the calm, unmoving eye of the hurricane of chaos. His reaction was instantaneous and profound. Fleet Master Chief Thorne, a man who had stood before congressional committees and had never once broken his military bearing, a man who junior officers saluted with genuine terror and awe, drew himself up to his full height. In the howling chaos of the storm, amidst the panicked breathing and the groaning of the building, he bellowed a single command that was louder and more powerful than any thunderclap. "Attention on deck!" The effect was electric. Every sailor in the room, out of pure, deeply ingrained instinct, snapped to the position of attention. Their backs straightened, their hands slapped to their sides, their eyes locked forward. It was a ludicrous, absurd gesture in the face of Armageddon, but it was the highest form of respect the Navy knew how to offer. Chief Miller, his mind numb with shock, found his body reacting before his brain did. He snapped to attention, his posture rigid, his heart hammering against his ribs. They were not coming to attention for the Fleet Master Chief. He was the one who had given the order. They were coming to attention for her. Thorn took 3 crisp, formal steps forward, stopping directly in front of the woman. He executed a salute so sharp, so perfect, that it could have been used in a training manual. It was not the casual salute one gives a superior officer. It was a gesture of profound, almost reverent respect, the kind reserved for only the most senior and storied leaders in the fleet. "Admiral Reed," he said, his voice ringing with an authority that finally put a name to the legend they were witnessing. "Fleet Master Chief Thorn reporting. My apologies for the delay, ma'am. The comms blackout was total. We intercepted your Valkyrie transmission via the P8 relay. All of PASIFLT command is now spun up and awaiting your orders. What do you require?" "Admiral." Reed. The name and the rank descended on the room like a physical weight, crushing the air from every lung. Chief Miller felt his knees go weak. Admiral. Not a captain. Not a commander. An admiral. A flag officer. And not just any admiral. The call sign Valkyrie was not just a name. It was a myth, a ghost story whispered in the shadowy corners of the special operations community. Valkyrie was the architect of the Navy's most classified asymmetrical warfare programs, the unseen hand behind a dozen Black Ops successes that would never be declassified. She was said to be a genius, a polymath with doctorates in physics and strategic studies, who had also passed the full SEAL training pipeline, Bud/S, in her youth. Before such a thing was even considered possible for a woman, her involvement a deeply buried secret. She was a plank owner of DevGru, a founding member of the elite unit some still called SEAL Team 6. She was not just an admiral, she was a warrior scholar, a living weapon, a figure of such monumental importance that her very presence on this god-forsaken atoll was inexplicable. And he had told her to shut up and listen to his drunken sea story. He had flicked her book to the floor. The cold dread in his stomach turned into a sickening, icy slush. He felt as though he were falling from a great height. He was not just going to be disciplined, he was going to be erased. His career, his reputation, his very existence in the Navy he loved were over. He had not just insulted an officer, he had desecrated a holy relic. Admiral Reed lowered the radio. She returned Thorn's salute with a gesture just as crisp, an economical motion of her hand. "Master Chief," she said, her voice still calm. "Good to see you. I need you to take tactical command of the on-site personnel evacuation. Get everyone to Sector Gamma. I am retaining strategic oversight of asset preservation." She handed a small data slate to the junior officer who had accompanied Thorn. "This contains a revised storm surge inundation model and a structural load-bearing analysis for the primary hangars. Get it to the base engineer. Tell him to divert all available foam suppression systems to reinforce the western wall of Hangar 3. It's got a micro-fissure in the support structure that the original plans don't account for." "Aye, Admiral," Thorn said, his voice utterly devoid of question. He turned and began issuing orders with the booming efficiency for which he was famous, his presence instantly organizing the remaining sailors into effective teams. The machine of the Navy, which had sputtered and failed under the lieutenant and Chief Miller, was now running smoothly, perfectly, under the guidance of its true masters. Admiral Reed then turned her head, her gaze sweeping past the now organized sailors, past the scurrying officers, until it landed, with pinpoint accuracy, on Chief Gunner's mate Hector Miller. He was still frozen at the position of attention, a statue of disgrace. Her blue eyes, cold and analytical, bored into him. She took a single step toward him. He flinched, an involuntary spasm of pure terror. She stopped a few feet away. The howling of the wind was a constant scream, but in the space between them, there was a pocket of absolute silence. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "Chief Miller," she said, her tone level and clinical. It was the voice of a doctor delivering a terminal diagnosis. "Yes, Admiral," he managed to choke out, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Your tactical assessment of the situation in this room, prior to the alert, was a failure," she began, her words precise and cutting. "You misidentified a potential asset as an irrelevant distraction. You attempted to assert dominance through volume and minor physical aggression, a tactic that is effective only on the timid and the undisciplined. It is a sign of profound insecurity in one's own authority. It is the tool of a bully, not a leader." Each word was a perfectly placed shot, dismantling the entire edifice of his identity. "Your response to the crisis," she continued, relentless, "was to fall back on rote memorization of procedures that were inadequate for the present threat. You shouted orders that would have led to the deaths of your men. You allowed your own limited experience to blind you to the reality of the situation. Your failure was not one of courage, but of imagination. It is a failure I have seen lead to catastrophic losses in the field." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle on him. He felt stripped bare, his pride, his reputation, his entire self-image flayed away, until only the raw, trembling shame remained. He expected the final blow, the words that would end his career. "You are relieved of your duties," or "report for disciplinary action." But that was not her way. Punishment was inefficient. Education was permanent. "When this is over," she said, her voice dropping slightly, becoming even more intense, "you will report to my staff. You will be my new executive assistant. You will carry my gear. You will manage my schedule. You will sit in every briefing, every planning session, every after-action review. You will learn the difference between the authority that is given to a uniform and the authority that is earned through competence. You will learn that the most dangerous threats are often the ones you underestimate. And you will learn that the loudest voice in the room is often the most ignorant." She held his gaze. "Do you understand your new duties, Chief?" It was not a punishment. It was a life sentence. A sentence to be educated. A sentence to be humbled, every single day, by forced proximity to the living embodiment of his own catastrophic failure. It was a fate far more devastating and far more instructive than any court-martial. "Yes, Admiral," he whispered, his voice broken. "I understand." "Good," she said. Then she turned away, her attention already back on the larger battle, on the data streams and the wind speeds and the myriad of complex problems that she alone had the vision to solve. To her, the confrontation with Chief Miller was already over, a minor variable that had been assessed, corrected, and repurposed. For Chief Miller, it was the beginning of a long, arduous, and ultimately transformative journey. He was no longer the king of the sandpiper's perch. He was now a student in the most demanding school in the world. The storm, for all its fury, eventually passed. The atoll was battered, but thanks to the intervention of Admiral Reed, it survived. The critical assets were saved, Not a single life was lost. The legend of what happened that night in the Sandpiper's Perch began to spread almost immediately. It traveled on the comms channels, in hushed conversations in chow halls, and in formal after-action reports that were immediately classified at the highest level. The story became a modern military fable, a cautionary tale passed down from seasoned chiefs to new recruits. The details would shift with each telling. The bar became rougher. Chief Miller's taunts became crueler. Admiral Reed's commands became more impossibly brilliant. But the core of the story, the essential truth of it, remained. Years passed. The name Hector Miller, once a synonym for arrogant disgrace, slowly began to mean something else. He did, as ordered, report to Admiral Reed's staff. The first year was a living hell of humiliation. He was, as she had promised, little more than a bag carrier, a glorified valet forced to witness a level of intellectual and strategic brilliance that he could barely comprehend. He stood in the back of rooms where she briefed generals and secretaries of defense, his own three-service stripe uniform feeling like a cheap costume. He watched her solve problems in minutes that entire teams of experts had struggled with for weeks. He saw her treat everyone, from a janitor to a four-star general, with the same level of calm, professional respect, a respect predicated not on their rank, but on their competence within their given role. Slowly, painfully, he began to learn. He stopped seeing her actions as a personal rebuke and started seeing them as a lesson. He began to listen, truly listen, not just to her words, but to the logic behind them. He started reading the books she left on her desk, trying to understand the vast, interconnected world she inhabited. His own narrow, rigid worldview began to crack, and then it shattered, and from the pieces, something new and better began to grow. He discovered that true authority was not about being the loudest, it was about being the most credible. He learned that respect was not something you could demand. It was a byproduct of demonstrated excellence. Admiral Reed, for her part, never once mentioned the incident in the bar again. She treated him as she treated all her staff, as a professional whose potential she was duty-bound to develop. After 2 years of grueling service as her assistant, she personally recommended him for the Senior Enlisted Academy, and then for a position as an instructor at the very school for new Chief Petty Officers, where the seeds of his own arrogance had been sown. And that is where one could find him. A decade after that fateful night, Master Chief Hector Miller, his hair now streaked with gray, stood before a class of newly minted chiefs, the future leadership of the enlisted fleet. He was no longer the loud, boisterous caricature of his youth. He was quiet, thoughtful, his voice calm and measured. His authority was no longer a performance. It was a deep, settled thing that emanated from a place of hard-won wisdom. He was one of the most respected and effective instructors at the academy. He always ended his final lecture with the same story. He would tell them about a remote atoll, a grimy bar, and a loudmouthed chief who thought he was the king of the world. He would tell them about a quiet, unassuming woman reading a book. He would spare no detail of his own foolishness, his own prejudice, his own spectacular failure of judgment. He would paint a vivid picture of his own public humiliation, not for their entertainment, but for their education. She never raised her voice, he would tell the silent, wide-eyed chiefs. She never had to. Her competence was her argument. Her actions were her rank. She taught me the most important lesson any leader can ever learn. The uniform gives you the house, but it's what you do inside that makes it a home. Authority is a shell. Credibility is the core. Never, ever mistake one for the other. And never, for the love of God, judge the lethality of a weapon system by the quietness of its standby mode. The story of Admiral Evelyn Reed, call sign Valkyrie, became a cornerstone of modern naval leadership training. It served as a stark, powerful reminder that substance will always, in the end, triumph over style. That true strength is not loud, but quiet, coiled, and ready. It is a lesson about the fatal flaw of underestimation, about the danger of letting prejudice build the lens through which you see the world. It is a story about a moment of profound, public injustice, followed by the suspense of an unnatural calm, the awe of masterful skill, the satisfaction of a public reveal, and the ultimate catharsis that comes not from punishment, but from the complete and total dismantling of an arrogant worldview and its patient reconstruction into something better, stronger, and far, far wiser.